People who watch my channel have heard me mention from time to time that I don't vote, and in fact, I'm quite public about not voting. This hasn't exactly been a theme of my work online. It's something that I never imagined I'd make a video about. But nevertheless, it's come up in a few conversations, and considering the fact that I typically advocate for people to be very active in their communities, to be an active political presence in the real world, despite the fact that I'm pessimistic, I'm certainly not someone who's advocating for withdrawal. That's the worst thing anyone can do, even if you're like me and feel very alienated from modern society. So given that I generally have a positive outlook on participation and community action, some people have asked why I don't vote and why I generally tell other people that they should consider not voting, at least as a matter of habit, not unless there's something specific on the ballot that you think you can influence with casting your actual vote. Now, originally when I received a lot of these questions in the comments and one or two via email, it didn't immediately occur to me that I should make a video on this topic. I felt like I didn't really have a good principle to communicate. I didn't think I could make a really good narrative around why I don't vote, but then I thought a little bit harder, and I realized that my decision eventually to not vote as a matter of principle revolved around a few moments in my own life that did, in fact, communicate a very acute lesson about politics, how exchanges of political power work, and how in a lot of ways the voting system has, well, for lack of a better word, connived a lot of us into selling our political power short when it comes to actually holding our leaders accountable. So I realized that my own story about why I no longer vote, or why I decided to no longer vote, dates back to a particular time and place, a particular election in a particular state that I lived in, that state being Michigan, and that time being 2008. The election, of course, being the 2008 presidential election. Now, the reason why the time and place are so absolutely critical for this particular story is due to a very particular moment I found myself in during that election. Of course, as most people know who listen to this channel, I grew up in California. I lived for a long time in California and Washington and other West Coast states. But for a brief period in my mid-20s, I lived in Michigan. Now, of course, my time in Michigan also happened to fall around a few key political events. The first one being my furthest swing to the left after I departed from my original high school libertarianism. At this point, thanks in large part to the failures of the Republican Party during the Bush administration and a variety of other disillusionments I had had with examining conservative ideas, once they were divorced from the purely abstract arguments about how markets work, led me to believe that the true political vision that would be right for America was essentially the modern democratic one, was essentially the idea of a globalist welfare state, a globalist managed economy, making use of markets, of course, to make sure that market productivity was up to snuff and able to pay for all the programs people needed for basic needs. And of course, sure enough, just as I made this leftward turn, albeit probably more slightly than most people do in their mid to early 20s, the dream progressive candidate had just come onto the scene, Barack Obama. Now, a lot of people who may have come of age in the post-2012 political environment, I know I have a lot of more young people who watch my channel, might not really be aware of what the 2008 Barack Obama political campaign was really telling America, what it was really promising, if only implicitly. In the figure of Barack Obama was the promise of a fully reformed Democratic Party that could finally push through all of the necessary reforms. And of course, in the 90s, despite Clinton's moderation, the Democratic Party, and indeed most of the Democratic sympathetic media, was really pushing the idea that many of the problems America had was due to insufficient reform from the left end of the aisle. By pushing through this reform, Barack Obama might be able to fix the fundamental problems that beset America, that led to it being so divided, that led to the economy being an unreliable engine of prosperity. Moreover, the image of Barack Obama and what he promised to do with race relations was nothing short of messianic. His image itself sold the idea that this might be a turning point for race relations inside America. And although no explicit promises were made, this certainly wasn't something that the campaign of Barack Obama was trying to explicitly deny. The figure of Obama was everything that a moderate Democrat might ever hope for. And in 2008, I had a chance to vote for him. But it wasn't just that. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the American political system, although I can't imagine who isn't at this stage, having gone through many American elections that get international attention, may not know the concept of the Electoral College and swing states. Now, for the most part, the American presidential campaign is only really seriously fought in a few states, and for large liberal states like California or Washington, where I had spent most of my life, the contest isn't really very important. The state is almost certainly going to go to the Democrats, and one more vote for a Democratic candidate or one more vote for a Republican one isn't going to change anything. The candidates and their campaigns spend the most time in swing states. And so for my previous presidential elections, although come to think of it, I'd only voted in one before, the vote I had cast didn't make a big impact. It wouldn't have that much value in a general strategic sense on the national stage. But now that I was a resident of Michigan, I was in a swing state. My vote actually made a difference. Michigan might go for McCain or it might go for Obama, and the vote I cast would have as much impact as I might hope for a vote to have. In fact, I remember on election day having relatives in California call me and remind me to vote because my vote in that election would have had so much more impact than theirs would have. It was silly, but I was grateful for the opportunity. So come election day, I went to the ballot and I cast my vote. And of course, I was looking through the ballot and there were all sorts of local measures, municipal ones, state ones, propositions that were being put to the electorate. Several I had some idea of and I cast my vote for them, but others I had very little idea. Everything I knew came from essentially the voter information guide, and I alternated between trying to make an educated guess about what the right decision was and just leaving that part of the ballot blank. Nevertheless, when I walked out of the polling booth, I felt like I had accomplished something. I felt like my voice was being counted. This was part of a process that I believed in. And then, of course, reality set in. I went to my school. I was going to university at the time in a large state college, and the first thing I came across when walking on campus was a sight that everyone will see in college campuses come election day: the student political lobbying organizations handing out prizes for voting. And of course, seeing that made me think back to a few months earlier where people were handing out packages of socks and underwear, things that college students are in short supply of, in exchange for getting students to register to vote. The entire affair seemed ridiculous, and of course, this just highlighted the same observation that everyone makes when you cast your vote. You're essentially casting it with a bunch of people who are totally uninformed. Moreover, thinking back to the ballot that I myself had a hard time figuring out, I had to come to the conclusion that these frat boys and manifestly uninformed and politically apathetic students were confronted with the same policy questions on a municipal level and on a state level that I had struggled with, even after giving the voter information guide a fairly thorough read-through. What's the possibility that they themselves gave a considered read-through of the voter information guide? And would that even be enough if they had? Now, of course, all of this is totally pedestrian. It's an emotion that pretty much everyone who votes in a modern country is going to feel. Your votes are being cast with the same people who pretty much have no knowledge or investment in the election's result. But of course, this time it hit me a little bit deeper. This was the one election where I was the fabled swing state voter. This was the one election where my vote counted. I'd spent countless hours listening to Barack Obama ask me for my vote. I had spent countless hours worrying about who would actually win the most of them. But in the end, the decision was no more meaningful than a pack of socks and underwear for most college students. At the end of the day, it didn't really make any more difference. Presumably, I could have just bought the goods and bribed some apathetic person to vote in my place, and the result would have been the same, politically speaking. But of course, these emotions are not unusual, and everyone has sort of a ready-made immune response to these concerns. We have sort of mental tropes that keeps these concerns from manifesting an actual dissatisfaction with participating in Republican democracy. And the objection goes something like this. Well, we need better civics. We need more importance placed on getting people informed about the issues, making sure that they know the gravity of what they're voting for. And if ignorant people vote vote, that is a failure of our educational institutions. That's a failure of our political system to properly speak to their needs. And in the meantime, upstanding, educated voter, your role is to set a good example by being informed and voting and being excited about voting on election day. Now, if I chuckle to myself when I say that, it's because I can't believe anyone believes this, but people still do believe this to a large extent. In fact, I hear repetitions of just this explanation every time I tell people that I, as a matter of principle, don't vote. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Needless to say, the election of 2008 was much less satisfying in a civic sense than I'd imagined it would be, but that really didn't bring me to any conclusion about voting. But strangely enough, I happened upon a very interesting conversation on a totally unrelated topic that made me think again about the nature of voting and the nature of participating explicitly in a democratic-republican process for selecting leaders. Again, like I said, in most cases. And this conversation happened several months later, when of course the winter season came upon Michigan, and I experienced my first truly cold winter. One where the roads were iced over and frozen, and salt needed to be periodically sprinkled across highways and thoroughfares in order to make sure that cars didn't slide out because of the lack of friction. Now, during this time, I had a friend who worked in automotive safety, in engineering areas of the road to be more safe, to be less accident prone. And in conversation with this friend, I happened to come across one particular story concerning a particularly dangerous freeway on-ramp. Now, like many areas in Michigan roads, this particular on-ramp had obviously been designed for eras in America where drivers were used to a much lower average speed limit. And as such, despite the fact that there were numerous warnings that the curve could only be taken at 30 miles per hour, drivers nonetheless drove much faster when getting on and off the highway at this particular point. And as a consequence, there are numerous examples of them skidding right off the road, even in perfectly good weather circumstances. Well, strangely enough, my friend who worked in automobile safety pointed out the fact that there were actually many fewer accidents during the winter months, when conditions were ostensibly much more treacherous in terms of low friction, than there were during the summer ones, when the weather was generally better. And this was mainly due to the fact that there were on this highway numerous signs pointing to the danger of black ice. Now again, for people who might not come from wintry environments, black ice are invisible patches of ice that totally blend into the road, such that when a driver drives over one, he immediately loses control of his vehicle, in a way that's very, very terrifying, and can be the cause of quite a few accidents. And of course, as one might imagine, drivers in wintertime are always very cautious about black ice. If you hit it once, it's a terrifying experience and you'll not want to repeat it at high speeds. At any rate, once the signs warning about black ice were put on this already dangerous piece of highway, drivers very understandably started behaving very cautiously. They couldn't see the danger, and they started driving very much below the posted speed limit. And as a consequence, they very, very rarely skidded off the road at this particular on-ramp. Now, of course, this is a very understandable element of human nature having to do with risk aversion, but it set aside something in my own mind that got me to think more critically about how people could be compelled into certain types of action. In this particular case, it didn't matter how big the 30 miles per hour curve sign was written, people would simply ignore it. But the second that there was an uncertain possibility of an incredible danger that everyone had a visceral emotional response to, everyone immediately modified their behavior to become more safe, to actually comply with the intention of the traffic controllers. And for a brief moment, it immediately popped into my mind if this might not also be applicable to politics, to making sure politicians obey the will of voters, or in particular, the will of myself, the voter, myself as an interested political party. Was I indeed being the easy to ignore 30 mile per hour curve sign that no one listened to because they thought they understood what it meant and how they could essentially dismiss it? Or was I being the much more effective threat of black ice, the unpredictable massive danger that naturally causes everybody who's aware of it to respect it? Now, of course, I didn't really put two and two together. But as the years went on and 2008 turned into 2012, as I became increasingly disillusioned with not only the Democratic political project, but also the mainstream liberal political project in America, I began regularly questioning whether my belief in voting or democracy was really warranted at all. At the end of 2014, I had to make some very uncomfortable conclusions about my relationship to the American political body as a whole. It was clear, at least, that in my own political and cultural beliefs, in what I deeply felt was wrong with American society, I was a minority. I was someone whose perspective in American political discourse was simply not being entertained. I had a fundamentally different vision for society than most of the people who I interacted with on a day-to-day basis. Most of the people in the American electorate. Moreover, the people who were setting the course of the country, despite the fact that they were themselves a minority, and probably their vision of what America would look like in 50 years would certainly not be assented to by a majority of people who are currently voting, were nevertheless doing quite well when it came to advancing their agenda, and were very happy to use people of my own political and cultural beliefs as scapegoats for why everything in America was going the wrong way. Something wasn't adding up politically. I think the final piece fell into place when I heard that mainstream conservative and National Review writer Kevin Williamson, along with several other people from the mainstream left publication Vox, didn't vote. They didn't bother, despite writing for political magazines, despite having their views reflected back to them by politicians in a way that I never have and never probably will hear my own political or cultural beliefs repeated back to me by politicians at any national or state level. After all of the political influence they wielded, after the entire political dynamic was essentially shaped by their views, by the columns they wrote, by the think pieces they published, despite the fact that they had politicians that in many ways did speak to what they thought were the priorities, they still didn't bother to vote. And that's because they realized that voting was ineffective. Voting was misguided. It fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between the politician and the person casting the ballot. And to participate in it is to participate in self-delusion, and to essentially train oneself into misunderstanding how actual political power is wielded inside a system like the one we've created in modern America. At the end of the day, politicians respond to incentives. And so, regardless of what we say about democracy or any kind of civic duty, the fundamental question we should be asking ourselves is to what degree our actions actually influence that pool of incentives that a politician will have when he's making his decisions one way or the other. And given how contemporary politicians do vote, it's not hard to see what actually makes a difference and what doesn't. Of course, politicians are always worried about getting reelected, but for instance, if a politician were to look at my own desires in a crowd full of people who may have been encouraged to vote by getting a free package of socks and only been reminded to vote on election day because people were handing out pizza for free to people with I voted stickers. If a politician sees me in that crowd, my voice in that multitude is fundamentally meaningless. All it amounts to is white noise. One person says one thing in a certain direction, and then there's three more that say it in a completely opposite direction. It's indiscernible. It does not send a proper communication that this issue is important, or that some particular concern needs to be addressed directly. What does get politicians' attention is direct political lobbying, either through organization, the press or social media in the broadest sense, or direct communication to somebody who is actually getting FaceTime with them on a day-to-day basis. Now, people talk about lobbying like it's some fundamental exploitation of democracy. I suppose that might be true in some sense if we lived in some type of pure democracy, but of course we don't. And from my understanding of pure democracy, we would never want to be. In reality, lobbying is the only effective way at actually getting political goals realized. Just think of any of the major political victories that have occurred over the last 100 years, from the passage of the New Deal to civil rights to to the decision to go to war in Iraq. Every one of these political motions was brought about by lobbying, not by direct votes. And people who did not participate in this lobbying were essentially political non-entities. Now, of course, I think people probably have a mythological idea of how lobbying works. They imagine some smoke-filled room where people are passing back and forth papers and bottles of whiskey and vacations to the Bahamas. But in fact, lobbying is much more general. Lobbying is essentially attending your city council meeting and talking to your representatives afterwards. Lobbying is writing a letter to your congressman. Lobbying is creating a large following on social media that can respond and, most importantly, be noticed by people who eventually have to go up for re-election. This is how actual political power is used inside a republic, and it always has been. And this is more or less what people like Kevin Williamson and a bunch of writers from Vox realized when they admitted that they didn't vote. They already wrote nationally syndicated columns. They already had large platforms. They already had loud voices on social media. Voting is a long and arduous process. It could take you up to 3 hours when everything is said and done to cast a ballot on election day during general election. But of course, for anyone with political connections, this same amount of influence, in fact, much more political influence could be gained by just making a single tweet in 5 minutes, by writing an article, by giving some politician favorable or unfavorable coverage. And when you match the utility of that action against the action of waiting in line to cast a single vote in a sea of people who essentially make your voice white noise to a politician, it becomes a futile endeavor for anyone with eyes in their head to see. And it's not just futile for people with columns. Whoever you are, if you're voting age right now, imagine some issue that you deeply care about that is coming up for a decision in the next 4 years or after the next election you plan to vote on. Then think of how much time in your day it actually will take you to cast a ballot and compare it to the following action. Take whatever issue you care about, download a letter to the congressman template from online, slap your own pet issue into the document, and then follow it up with some insinuation of political consequences for said congressman come election day. Slap on a forever stamp and put that sucker in the mail, and in 20 minutes you have just executed more political power than casting 20 ballots. And in the end, it seems that actually waiting in line to cast a ballot, or even mailing one in, is an exercise in demonstrating that you don't actually understand how power is divvied up in our society, in a real world sense. Now, of course, I'm sure people are going to cast this video as if I'm making some kind of attack on Republican democracy, and maybe I am making an implicit one, but of course, I don't necessarily think that holding elections is bad. Obviously, I've said before that I am more or less neutral when it comes to political systems. I think they all have good elements and are largely dependent on the culture of a people and the time in which they're executed. But at any rate, regardless of whether democracy is good or bad, I think it's incumbent upon people who are politically aware, who are educated, to realize what a bad deal casting a vote is when it comes to making your voice heard, and how by casting one, you're actually just participating in mass delusion, even when it comes to participating in a Republican form of government. If you want to change things, become involved in lobbying, become involved in community organizing. Demonstrate that you understand how the political system you want to change actually works. Now, of course, I can already sense yet another objection coming from people who are perhaps of a Kantian persuasion, perhaps giving a more intellectual version of the civic duty argument for why you should vote. You're sending a message, you're being the upstanding, informed citizen that other people can model themselves around. You have a duty to do that because it's the universally right behavior. It's the categorical imperative. If no one voted, if no informed voters participated in our system would collapse. And just by the act of voting, you are communicating some type of political message that is heard by people outside of just yourself and whoever is counting up your ballot at the end of this process. Well, in part, I do agree you are sending a political message of sorts by being an educated, informed voter. Unfortunately, that political message is a vindication, is a vote of confidence for the system that holds your own voice as equivalent to somebody who is totally informed and might be voting for entirely mercenary reasons. It's a vote of confidence for our current political order, a vote of confidence for our current cultural order. The net effect of voting is not only to distract one from the more important job of lobbying and organizing. The other foot, the double whammy of participating in mass Democratic Republican elections, is that it simultaneously takes your own political preferences and makes them a known quality to politicians, something that can be gamed, something that can be focus grouped. And by your very participation, you have endorsed the status quo. In fact, to return to my original story, the participation in mass Republican Democratic systems controls politicians the same way that a 30-mile-per-hour turn sign doesn't control motorists. It politely identifies a singular, acute obstacle of no real danger that the politician, or the driver in the analogy, might want to be aware of in the future, but probably won't have to actually worry about, if worst comes to worst. Besides, just like motorists have seen countless 30-mile-per-hour turn signs that really didn't need to be there, a seasoned politician will have seen many swells in the polls that can be chalked up to random chance and really shouldn't have to be dealt with in any serious policy way. In essence, voting is essentially showing one's hand in the game of politics. Showing one's hand for a purpose, showing one's hand as an act of assent to the political order that rules us, but still, nonetheless, it is a decrease of ultimate power. It makes it easier for politicians to get away without actually paying attention to what's being demanded by your particular group. And if you're like myself, or anyone on the distant right, or for that matter, anyone on the distant left, you have no interest in providing the present system with that kind of vindication, with that kind of validation. Because at the end of the day, that validation is going to be heard louder than any ultimate effect of the actual policy or politician platform that you're actually voting on. This is how dissatisfied minorities don't get heard. Now, of course, there's a second half to this analogy, and if we could return to the analogy to road signs and road dangers, what if instead of acting like the 30-mile-per-hour turn sign that everyone saw as being ineffective, to instead acting more like black ice, or to be more precise, the threat of black ice? What if a determined minority group focused themselves on being that invisible lurking danger to a politician's career? That possibility that, while rare, could be incredibly dangerous, could be incredibly terrifying for the subject. Human beings are really risk-averse creatures, and once they're exposed to something that actually terrifies them, where they can feel something that they value being physically taken away in only a second, they will respond to that reality. They'll respond to that fear. And that's where the power of the threat comes into play. Black ice is scary, and motorists respect it. They respect even the possibility of it existing, whereas they don't respect the certainty of a 30-mile-per-hour turn. This is also why politicians pay so much attention to people who are lobbying them, to people who write letters to them, because what they're ultimately afraid of is that some powerful group, some well-connected group, or some well-organized group is ultimately going to come after their jobs in a very fast and very real way, in a way that a spin doctor can't take care of, and in a way that can't be managed by a focus group. Take, for instance, the possibility that we might totally reimagine our relationship to mass democracy in the modern world. What if, instead of casting a ballot for the lesser of two evils every 4 years or every 2 years as your election cycle allows, you became totally politically silent? Didn't vote for a year, didn't become part of the entire back and forth of the polling, but instead wrote letters, but instead organized, but instead learned politicians' names, learned administrators' names, learned donors' names. Then, after several years for petitioning politely and organizing for your cause, and lobbying in all the legal ways available to you in a modern democracy, you decided to take one politician that crossed whatever line your particular political priority had set up, one politician that was being particularly dishonest with you? What if you selected one leader standing for election, one candidate, and came down on them with every ounce of political fervor and spite that could be summoned? What if you could destroy their political career to the extent that they would never recover, to the extent that they fundamentally had to retire from politics because they crossed a bright line? Once something like that happens, other politicians take note. Other politicians feel their collars getting a little bit more tight. Understand that you're a force that has to be reckoned with. Moreover, the fact that this was suddenly unleashed as opposed to something that built up gradually and could be visible immediately builds in the mind of the leader the same threat potential that the black ice had to motorists driving on a dangerous road. The random possibility of a sudden downside is the ultimate form of political lobbying. And of course, you see this in all types of situations where a minority has to contend with a larger majority. I probably don't need to bring up the instances of Muslim communities in Europe objecting and rioting over depictions of Muhammad appearing in cartoons, but we could also go to prison populations, where in some ways the safest place you could be is being seen as an unpredictably vindictive person, as a person who might look passive but could snap in an instant and be capable of all types of violence. People naturally do not want to interfere with somebody's plans who's in that position. It makes their political calculations difficult. It essentially makes them equivalent to political black ice. And that is how actual power is wielded. That's how human behavior is compelled, is encouraged. I know this is a cynical take, and I certainly don't believe that humans only respond to threats. Humans only respond to extreme danger. But politics is the art of the possible. And in this present reality we are in, if you find yourself in a distant movement, this is the option that's available to you. And voting actively hurts that. Because at the end of the day, I do sincerely believe in politics. I believe that Christians and traditionalists and all people of a moral nature need to participate in politics. They have a duty to participate in politics for the next generation. But they also have a moral duty to be intelligent about how they participate in those politics, and not to sell themselves short or to consign themselves into an easily managed passivity. We all want to stand up and be heard, but I certainly have no interest in standing up and being heard if that process essentially endorses a system that I disagree with more than my actual voice will help in reforming it. And for this reason, I think a reconsideration of voting, in all but very acute instances where there's a particular issue you might actually influence at minimal cost to your other projects, needs to be questioned. We need to understand whether voting is actually a responsible exercise of political power, given everything we know about how political behavior operates in the modern world. Now, to bring it full circle for a quick take that has been so thoroughly story-based, I find that my own story about not voting has kind of an ironic capstone that happened to me during the last special election in my own metropolitan area, Seattle. Again, when at a coffee bar at a university, I was approached by a political activist, a thoroughly boomer type character, most certainly a leftover from the socialist movements of the 60s, equipped with the rose and a power to the people shirt, who approached me very earnestly with a clipboard to ask me in the most matronly but polite tone, "Have you voted?" I think she said something like, "Young man, have you made sure you're registered for the next election? Have you made sure you can do your civic duty?" And I remember doing a double take, not quite knowing how I was going to answer. And then after looking at the registration form and then back at this kind old woman, just saying to her matter-of-factly, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't believe in voting, and I think voting is a politically irresponsible act." And the look I received from this woman was just one of utter horror. It felt like I had taken her entire worldview and just tossed it in the dustbin. I'd blasphemed against one of her primary gods, the idea of civic participation in this mass democratic system. And of course, I made an amicable exit. I didn't want to be rude, but I remember walking away feeling quite sorry for this woman. She obviously was a political radical of the left variety, certainly, but nonetheless something I could sympathize with. Her views were not being being heard in the mainstream political order, yet nonetheless she was involved in such a facile and useless exercise. And all to endorse a system that probably she didn't believe in. A waste of time, certainly, at least in my opinion. But at any rate, that's it for the take. I hope you've enjoyed this perspective, even if you disagree with it, and have a wonderful evening.